finance, you wouldn't think of it as inherently a very political field. Is this? But you're saying it has become political, or has it always been? How is that, and how has it changed over time?
I mean, I think it's changed radically just in the past few years. I mean, you've been able to see it coming, but you know, a lot of sort of older finance professors view all of this as not their problem. Like the university's gone crazy, but we have our little corner where we still just talk about how to create value in firms. But if you look at everyone's talking about ESG and every environmental, social, and governance stuff. Everyone's talking about how you should be using your firms to advance social goals rather than um, profit, which is basically we should give up creating value for people and splitting consumer surplus and producer surplus, and instead we should take control of firms and turn them into social engineering things. We have like a sustainability major that's explicit, like the description of the major is explicitly like, here's how you can go enter a firm and manipulate it into becoming a advocate for leftist revolution. And I mean, this is a business school in the state of Texas. So the whole university is, people in business schools kind of recognize that the university has gone nuts, but it's getting more and more. And our current dean just completely wants to throw away the whole idea of teaching people how to operate in a firm and doing good things, and wants to change the world and bring in diversity, equity, and inclusion, all that. So yeah, it's getting pretty awful even in business.
The ESG, isn't it? I mean, isn't don't firms have a legal obligation to maximize shareholder value? How did ESG get in there? Am I wrong about that?
I mean, nobody. This is one thing you learn in finance is all these rules that people say that public firms have to abide by are they're very squishy, and nobody really knows what they mean, and it all comes down to whatever in whoever gets on the SEC's radar and they decide they're doing something wrong. So nobody in the federal government is going to crack down on somebody for destroying shareholder value in order to promote you know the interests of marginalized groups. Even if technically, if you read the rules, probably you shouldn't do that. But no one thinks that the feds are going to crack down on them for wasting shareholder money on that sort of thing. So it's effectively not illegal. It ought to be. You ought to face shareholder lawsuits, but all this has to get you to be really effective. You would need the SEC backing it up, and they're just going to say, "Oh no, as long as you're setting aside certain things to promote this political agenda, we're never going to touch you." If anything, if you actually pursued shareholder value without paying at least lip service to this type of activism, that's when you're going to get the attention of the regulators, and that's when they're going to start causing trouble. Like Elon Musk people start poking around in his affairs as soon as he says he doesn't want to do that sort of thing. So despite making electric cars cool. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah. Now, anyone with any knowledge of sort of administrative law knows that this is not unique to business, that there's an infinite number of laws, and they often have vague standards on top of vague standards, and they can't go after every possible violation. So technically there's, I guess, a legal case against ESG, but yeah, that makes sense. It doesn't matter that much.
right now, if you have sensible thoughts, there are very few departments in at the University of Texas where you can be hired. Like if you have sensible thoughts about society, you might be able to get hired in petroleum engineering as long as you keep them to yourself.
Yeah.
But if
And
you
so for
have
people listening to this, they might not, I mean, they might not have been in college for a while. I mean, they might think you sound crazy, and that, none of, it can't possibly be that bad. But me and you're in a university now. I've, been in universities recently. It's bad. There's, I think what they could show to people to say is the diversity statements. You basically, when you're hired now, and maybe promotion or other things too, you have to, express support for affirmative action, identity politics. It's not subtle. It's not like, your research is like, has this bias, this little bias, or that little bias. It's like there's loyalty oaths to the
you
regime at this
swear
point.
allegiance to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the particular definition of diversity, I mean, that's bad enough. We shouldn't have. I mean, I'm actually okay with like, hey, if you're coming to work for a state university, you shouldn't be advocating for overthrowing that government and replacing it with a totalitarian dictatorship. If someone proposed that loyalty oath, I would at least consider it. But you shouldn't have a loyalty oath to specific policies, and you certainly shouldn't have a loyalty oath to specific stupid policies. And what we have now is loyalty oaths to, the idea that we should have proportionate representation by identity groups with at least as much representation from marginalized groups as they are in the general population, rather than population. Plus, all those marginalized people who are hired for diversity must have a critical consciousness. So they must all be, so if you manage to hire Thomas Sowell, he doesn't count. Wilfred Riley doesn't count. So and not only is that the policy of the university, we all have to say we like that policy, or we can't get promoted. Like, I'm never going to be a full professor. I can say that right now, because I will never be able to score on that. And then inclusion, we have to be inclusive, which their definition means we can't ever say anything that makes marginalized groups with critical consciousness unhappy. So, in order to be employed at the University of Texas, you have to kind of commit to never stating a fact, no matter how true it is, that makes a marginalized person feel a member of a marginalized group. This could be a multimillionaire who happens to belong to one of these marginalized groups. If you make him unhappy, and not only do you have to commit to not making these people unhappy, you have to commit to supporting a policy of inclusion, i.e., don't make these people unhappy throughout. So yeah, it's that
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. And equity is
Right.
do they give you trouble for if you have a race blind, if you have a sort of woke capitalism, are they okay with that, or even is even the sort of the capitalist idea sort of hard to maintain on the
So
university?
I'm a little so it's okay for some people to get super rich as long as the number of people who are super rich is in proportion to
Yeah.
their share of the population. So it's okay. This is a great trick on the equity. It's like, okay, it's okay for like a handful of white people to be really rich, as long as we make sure that people from other groups are also really rich. But we need to make sure they didn't make their money through sort of ugly capitalism. It's okay to make your money by writing books about how horrible
No, but
society is.
that's just sort of the ideology. I'm wondering about sort of the litmus tests. Are there there was a some Substack I saw the other day about what's happened to the American Political Science Review, which was the top journal of political science. They basically a few years ago uh, they had a editorial board that was all women, purposely, and then they each of them study some kind of identity politics thing, and they were basically explicit about affirmative action. Are the finance journals or the business journals, or I mean, are they that bad yet, or is it
Um,
still are you still behind?
so econ has gotten So econ is probably worse than most people think political science is, but political science is so horrible people can't even probably conceive of that.
Yeah.
But no, uh, uh, the most recent AEA papers and proceedings, that's the most important conference in economics. It was overwhelmingly woke stuff. It was overwhelming identity discrimination. You always have to find, and in economics, even in economics, you have to find the right answer, or you're going to have a lot of trouble publishing. So I know people who found some very counter woke empirical evidence, and then they just sort of like, oh, well, that's never getting published. So I think it's safe to say that economics is worse than you would think the norm is, but it's still better than most. Finance is still a little, because most of asset pricing, things like that it's somewhat hard to politicize. But if you write an ESG paper, you really need to say that ESG is really good and we should all do this. You can't be sort of objective about it. A handful of people still are, but there are already full professors in Chicago. So
Yeah.
it,
Who's that professor who wrote I think you're referring to a blog post about the recent economics papers. Who was
John Cochran talked about that
yeah.
a bit.
Right.
Yeah. So that's a good post to go through.
Yeah, economics is
John,
getting there. I mean, you hear these complaints that economics is hostile towards women, women this, women that. That sort of seems to be the opening to change everything
yeah,
that was
and
taught
it's
in the advice.
they're pushing that, and they're making it so that um this kind of inclusion idea is coming hard into economics. Like you should not be criticizing the work of these people because they are somehow marginalized from economics. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that there's been a systematic exclusion of women from economics. For a long time, people didn't want to do that. I mean, only weird people want to do economics. So,
That's true.
suddenly judging um, that that should be in any reasonable proportion to any group is odd. But yeah, and very, very few people, very few of the sort of older men who are in a position of authority in economics are willing to stand up in any way to any of these accusations. They just melt immediately and then hire. Like, I mean, Chicago has been, I think, illegally hiring entirely based on sex for a number of years, or they did for a while. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
pretty bad.
Chicago's sad. Yeah, I mean, this stuff is happening quickly. I mean, if you got out of academia 5 years ago, I mean, it's a different world. So yeah, I mean, I'm I'm convinced. You're convinced. I don't think there's any dispute about how bad it is for anybody who's willing to sort of look at these things objectively, unless you're a social justice warrior and you think all this stuff is great
Yep.
anyway. I think if you're skeptical of this stuff, you have to understand academia is pretty bad.